July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was triumphantly signed by the Founding Fathers. It laid the foundation for our great nation based on the ideas of liberty, equality, and freedom. Although we had the idea for our nation down on paper, it was a whole new challenge to put the words into action. Our nation was nowhere near perfect when it first started off. We did not have universal liberty, equality, or freedom. However, from 1800 to 1877, many reform movements began in the United States that fought to achieve the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. The reform movements fought for causes such as women's rights, better working conditions, and improved education. In the early 1800s, the Industrial Revolution began, which shifted the focus of families from tending their country farms at home to working in factories in the cities. Men often were the ones who would work long hours during the day, while the woman would remain at home taking care of the children and doing things that were classified by a stereotypical term, womanly, such as knitting, cleaning, and cooking. The Industrial Revolution brought a clear distinction between home and work. Women were expected to stay at home, while the men went out to work. This is also the same time when the early women's movement first emerged. As the women started their fight for equality and liberty, they argued that they needed greater political power to fully promote their ideas. To gain the much-needed political power, the Seneca Falls Convention, which was the first organized women movement, was formed. Women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretta Mott led the convention. Elizabeth Cady Stanton argued that every woman has the right to live freely and equally with men. Over time, because of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the Seneca Falls Convention's focus turned from just generally expanding women's rights to gaining the right to vote. Although women were not successful in making men and women equal, they did have some successes. By 1860, the early women's movement persuaded 15 states to pass laws which allowed women to keep their property if the husband died. The early women's movement made progress towards achieving the goals of the Declaration of Independence because women were brought a few steps closer towards complete equality with men. They set the stage for larger women's movements later in history, and they exercised their right of free speech. Around that same time, people also began fighting for public education that would be offered to all citizens. It became known as the Education Reform Movement. In the early 1800s, only wealthy, white male citizens received good educations. But with the huge influx of immigrants between 1820s to 1830s, many people believed that government-funded public education was needed to create educated voters. Having educated voters would strengthen the democracy, give many of the new immigrants and citizens a say in the government, and also give them a sense of purpose in society. Providing people with a better education also allows them to have more freedom because they can achieve more in life, such as property, better jobs, and possibly even a position in government. The education reform movement was very successful. In 1837, a Massachusetts legislator named Horace Mann formed a Massachusetts State Board of Education. He was president of the board for 12 years, and in his time as president, he opened 50 new schools, doubled teachers' salaries, and developed training schools for teachers. Massachusetts quickly became a role model for public education for the rest of the country. The early workers' movement started around 1820 to 1830. In hopes of gaining more rights, workers joined labor unions so that they would have greater power. The groups started off slow due to insufficient funding and the lack of companies taking them as professional groups. It wasn't until the 1840s when President Martin Van Buren supported the unions and they achieved what they hoped to. By doing so, the groups gained ground and businesses began to recognize them as licensed groups. After a victory in a Supreme Court case, union strikes became legal. Although the movement was slow to begin with, it grew in power as the Industrial Revolution came around and more workers were needed in the factories. As time went on, the rights of workers grew and became a very important necessity in the United States society. Because of the early workers' movement, the working conditions and wages of employees are secured today. The government was changed dramatically when Andrew Jackson won the election of 1828. He won vast support because he could strongly relate to many of the average citizens, because his origins were not much different from that of the average American citizen. Jackson was a strong believer that in a democratic society the majority should rule, and the average citizen should be an active part of their government. This led to the use of the spoils system, which is the act of giving supporters government positions based on the loyalty to their party. Because Jackson had a huge number of supporters in the western frontier, the government began flooding with ordinary citizens. Instead of being dominated by wealthy landowning citizens with high social class, the government began to truly represent the people. Having a greater say in government, the vast majority of the population, which was just like average citizens mostly living on the western frontier, were able to expand upon their liberties and freedoms. For example, the new government officials changed the way presidential candidates were elected. Instead of using the caucus system, where candidates were elected by a specific caucus party, and it was restricted to mostly the wealthy elite citizens who were well connected, the system was changed to the national nominating system. The national nominating system was a gathering of delegates from all the states who would come together to choose the candidates, and it greatly broadened the selection for presidential candidates. The reform movement started 1800 to 1877 greatly expanded upon the rights of American citizens. By fighting for the expansions of their freedoms, liberty, and equality, the reform movements brought the country closer to fulfilling the ideals of the Declaration of Independence.
Awakening ministers also preached the values of sobriety, industry, and self-discipline, which had become the essence of both the market economy and the impulse for reform. There are 3 points I want to make about the religious nature of all these 19th century reform movements. First, it was overwhelmingly Protestant. Like all these new religions were Protestant denominations, which meant that they wouldn't have a lot of appeal to immigrants from Ireland and Germany who started to pour into the United States in the middle of the 19th century because A, those people were mostly Catholic, and B, reasons we'll get to momentarily. Secondly, many of these reformers believed in perfectionism, the idea that individuals and society were capable of unlimited improvement. And third, many of the reform movements were based ultimately on a different view of freedom than we might be used to. And this is really important to understand. For 19th century reformers, freedom was the opposite of being able to do whatever you wanted, which they associated with the word license. They believed that true freedom was like an internal phenomenon that came from self-discipline and the practice of self-control. Essentially, instead of being free to drink booze, you would be free from the temptation to drink booze. According to Philip Schaff, a minister who came to Pennsylvania in the 1840s, true national freedom in the American view is anything but an absence of restraint. It rests upon a moral groundwork, upon the virtue of self-possession and self-control in individual citizens. Members of the fastest growing Protestant denominations, like Methodists and Baptists, were taught that it wasn't enough to avoid sin themselves. They also needed to perfect their communities. And that leads us to America's great national nightmare: